I'm Rob Bigelow, Executive Director and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Crystal Bridges. And the first thing I need to do is ask you to take out your phones and turn them to silent or off, if that hasn't been done already. And I ask you also to refrain from video or photography during the conversation. In your chair, you'll notice, if you haven't already, that you have a copy of a signed book, Portraits of Courage, from the President. So thank you for being here and being part of that effort. To begin, I take a moment to acknowledge and pay respect to the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw people and elders past, present, and future. We offer deep gratitude to the ancestral land and water that supports us as we're gathered here today at Crystal Bridges. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this event today. We're thrilled that we are able to host this very special exhibition. And at this time, my job is to introduce the moderator. I've got the easy work. The moderator is Dan Bartlett. Dan is the Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Walmart, responsible for government relations and public policy, corporate communications, philanthropy, and sustainability initiatives. How do you ever find time to do all that? Prior to that role, Dan served in several high-ranking positions at the White House, completing his service as a counselor to President George W. Bush in 2007. As one of the president's trusted advisors, he was responsible for all aspects of communication for the president and his administration, including the White House press office, speech writing, and the Office of Communications. He also played key roles in George W. Bush's presidential and Texas gubernatorial campaigns. Dan is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, and he served as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Texas, LBJ School of Public Affairs, and a fellow of the school's Center for Politics and Government. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dan Bartlett.
Yeah, don't you do. Thank you. President Bush just told me to make it shorter than that just happened there, but thank you, Rod. And good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today at Crystal Bridges Museum, where we are here at Walmart are honored to underwrite the general mission for all guests. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone here today for this special conversation with my former boss. The tables have turned a little bit here. Usually it was me who was preparing him for interviews, and now that I get to interview him, I'm kind of curious how this is going to go. I have a feeling I know how it's going to go, but and if you would have asked me back in the day when we were working together that I would be introducing him in the book of portraits as a painter, I'd have thought the world had gone crazy. I think Mrs. Bush said it best in the foreword. She said, "No way." Can we all please welcome the former First Lady, Laura Bush. So, after authoring 2 other New York Times bestsellers, Decision Points and 41, A Portrait of My Father, President Bush combined his writing talents with his post-presidential hobby, painting, and created a unique art book, Portraits of Courage, which brings together 66 full-color portraits and a 4-panel mural painted by President Bush of members of the United States military who have served our nation with honor since September 11th, and who he has come to know personally. Each painting is accompanied by the inspiring story of the veteran depicted, written by President Bush. Proceeds from Portraits of Courage go to support the work of the President Bush Military Service Initiative at the Bush Center, which works to ensure that post-9/11 veterans and their families make successful transitions to civilian life with a focus on gaining meaningful employment and overcoming the invisible wounds of war, traumatic brain injury, and post-traumatic stress. Joining us today on stage will be 2 of those military service members featured in President Bush's book, Major Christopher Turner, United States Army, and Nick Bradley, Staff Sergeant, United States Air Force, retired. Major Chris Turner joined the Army in 2005 through Clemson University's ROTC program. Chris served in many positions from a rifle platoon leader, an executive officer in Iraq, to a company commander in Afghanistan. On October 5th, 2013, Chris was wounded when an Afghan security guard fired on him and other soldiers. For the remainder of the deployment, Chris struggled more with the invisible wounds of war than the physical ones. For the years since that deployment, Turner sought help through various sources, but never consistently enough to heal. He credits his participation in the 2015 Bush Institute's Warrior Open and President Bush with his final commitment to treatment within the support and encouragement of his family, and his realization that he was not coping in a healthy manner. His primary support structure consisted of his wife, Katrina, and their children. Chris has researched and written extensively about PTS and now speaks openly about the day he was wounded and the struggles he continues to face. Additionally, Chris has been actively involved in the George W. Bush Institute's Military Service Initiative. Nick Bradley, Staff Sergeant, United States Air Force, retired, joined the military a few months before September 11th, 2001. After the start of the global war on terrorism, Bradley deployed to Iraq twice and flew more than 200 surveillance missions for troops outside the wire. In April 2008, Bradley is on deployment in Afghanistan, where he served on a personal security detail for 5 general officers. He conducted numerous missions, and on August 3rd, 2008, while on a protective services mission outside the wire, he was severely injured when his vehicle was struck by 20 pounds of anti-tank mine IED. Nick was medically retired from active duty on May 29th, 2009. He has had 19 surgeries and continues to attend occupational and physical therapy. Nick was inspired by his family and his love for golf during his recovery. Nick credits the Bush Center's Warrior Open golf tournaments for the introduction to his wife, Lindsay, the daughter of his first caddy at the 2011 tournament, and for the camaraderie with his fellow vets and servicemen and women. Through these support structures, Nick has been able to successfully transition to civilian life, working in marketing and sales outside of Dallas. And Bradley is a native of Emerson, Arkansas. So please welcome to the stage Major Chris Turner, Staff Sergeant Nick Bradley, and the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you all for having us. That applause for Laura was fantastic. I remember one time I was giving a speech and I said, Laura Bush was the greatest first lady ever. And the crowd erupted in cheers, and then I realized my mother was on the front row. Who, by the way, I know this isn't the topic, but I thought you'd be interested. So I asked her in the hospital in Houston, oh no, she said, I'm ready to die. And I said, wow, Mom, do you fear death? She said, not at all. I'm really looking forward to it, which was beautiful when you think about it. Then the doctor walked in and Mother said, you want to know why George W. turned out the way he did? And the doctor said, I think so, yes. And Mother said, because when I was pregnant with him, I drank and smoked. So, Rod, thank you very much for opening this beautiful facility for this exhibit. I'm like Bartlett. I'm a little shocked that I even have paintings displayed anywhere, much less one of the great art places in the country. I want to thank the Waltons, one of the great American families. And so thank you all for hosting Laura and me. Governor, thank you for being here, Madam First Lady. I thought you were busier than that, but anyway, it's
love
it. It's nice to have you. Bartlett?
I was wondering how long it was going to take to get a question ready.
Not bad. Yeah.
Not bad, yeah. All right, still got your fastball. So I think the big question for everybody is, how did you actually get in? I could not imagine you with your, when you play golf with President Bush, by the time you're lining up your putt, he's already teeing off on the next hole. He's quick, quick, quick. And so something so deliberative and patient as the art of painting, how did it come about?
Well, I was always a sensitive, centered person. You just never saw it. So the post-presidency is an interesting challenge because you're going from 100 miles an hour to like 2. You witnessed this. And so as Dan mentioned, I had written some books. We built this fantastic place at Southern Methodist University, which is meaningful and does some good programs. But it turns out it wasn't enough. And, I've come to realize what I missed was this fantastic learning experience of being president. In other words, my quest for knowledge was kind of slowed down. I was used to learning a lot on a daily basis, and all of a sudden I didn't. And by chance, I read Winston Churchill's essay, Painting as a Pastime. I'm a huge Churchill admirer, and so having read that, I said, if that guy can paint, I can paint. Now, what made that statement unbelievably unusual is that, as Laura would tell you, I was an agnostic on art. In other words, Bartlett, that means I really didn't give a damn. And so it was a stunning moment when I told her that I was going to be a painter. And we hired Gail. I mean, I was serious. And it turns out the art community was not my base of support. and neither was Gail. So in order to convince her of my seriousness, I said, Gail, there's a Rembrandt trapped in this body, and your job is to liberate him. And I got started painting. And it's changed my life. I view the world differently. I view color differently. I study art all the time. And my first instructor, Gail, convinced me to take the MoMA course online, which I did, anonymously, I might add. And but I paint every day. Every brushstroke's a learning experience. And my mission is to get as good as I can possibly get until I can no longer hold a paintbrush. And so, it's been great. And one of the great pleasures of my life, I spent a year painting these guys and women because I admire them a lot. And so you go to this exhibit, when you see it, just know that it's painted with a lot of respect and a lot of admiration. And and I'm honored that it's being displayed here.
But you didn't start with this project. You had some other projects like you were saying, you painted rocks and stuff like that. But then you painted world leaders.
So my mother challenged me. You can paint, yes, mother. I doubt it, and said, okay. So I said, all right, I can paint my dog. So I was a pet portrait painter, and they're a little easier to paint than people because they generally don't, dispute the painting. But so I painted pets. And then one of my instructors did something that is really important for teachers. I was introduced to this really good Dallas artist, and he said to me, you ought to paint the world leaders with whom you served. And I said, wow, man, I've only been painting for like 2.5 years. He said, I think you can do it. In other words, he raised my sights. And it's a really important part of teaching is to elevate somebody's vision of what is possible. And so I painted the world leaders with whom I served. And so the Dalai Lama, the Dalai and I were tight, by the way, and Blair, Putin, he's not going to like his painting. And so I like 20 of them, and we put it up for display, which was a little nerve-wracking because I was, again, a beginning artist. And it was called... It was a lesson on personal diplomacy. So in order to be successful in life, you've got to know the people you're dealing with. In order to be president, a decent president, you got to get to know the world leaders, no matter how large or small their country. And so the underlying theme was I got to know them well enough that I painted them. And so then I got a wonderful couple of instructors, an old hippie kind of guy, a Bernie Sanders guy. We don't, yeah.
That's as close as we're going to get to politics.
Yeah. No.
Put my old hat back on.
It's all art. It's all art. And then a young African-American painter who, named Cedric Huckabee, whose name, if you begin to really pay attention to art, is one of the really, really great young Texas painters. And he's the guy that convinced me to paint the Warriors. He said, paint the people nobody knows. In other words, that the first thing he'd heard about me doing was painting the people everybody knew, or most people. And I said, okay, I'm going to paint Warriors. And that's how the whole project got started.
Yeah. And there was 80-something portraits?
98.
98. And how long did that take you?
Year.
That's fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you paint every night, you know.
Yeah.
So I didn't watch Dancing with the Stars, and
But you're a man, I recall you're a man of routine, so you do it the same hour of the day?
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
It turns out the older I get, the harder it is to stand up for as long as I could. My legs get tired, and so my best painting now in the morning when I can hang in there, because I don't like to sit and paint, and so my legs wear out, and that's really one of the constraints.
Got it.
One of my instructors did something interesting for those of you in the art world. He said, "What do you want to learn?" And I said, "I want to learn color." And so he said, "Get rid of all your paint and only buy yellow, blue, and red." Now keep in mind, I'm young painter at this stage. Old guy, young painter. Old dog, new tricks. Anyway, and I've learned to mix paint. So every paint you see on the canvases in there is done with just primary colors, which it turns out to be a very important part, at least of my painting, because it tends to add continuity to the paintings. And I love color. So Leslie Zimmerman, that's her right there on the lower left, mountain biker, 3,000 casualties as a nurse in Iraq, came back obviously, traumatized, used mountain biking to help recover. And it's one of my favorite paintings because I love the way the kind of blue-green clashes with her red hair. Now, her hair's not red, it's kind of red. But that doesn't matter. What matters is, not to be exact, what matters is the color interaction trying to say something about Leslie Zimmerman's courage. Anyway, it's, yeah, there they are. How about Rodriguez? He's the next guy up. These guys know Rod really well. So Rodriguez wore dark glasses every time I was with him. And I ran into him in New York one time, and he had his glasses off. And he has this prosthetic eye, unbelievably interesting color. I said, "Let me take a picture of your eye, Rod." He thought it was kind of a weird request from his former commander-in-chief. And I said, "I'm going to paint your eye." I think he thought I was actually going to paint the actual eye, but as Turner and Nick will tell you, that Rod was hiding because of his wound. And part of healing is not to hide. And you'll hear these guys talk about it. And so anyway, my only point is color makes a huge difference for me. I hope people would say he's an interesting colorist.
Yeah. Interesting, of the 98 you painted, only one individual was painted twice.
Turner.
Who's on the stage here with us.
Well, look at that face. You can see why,
Why was that so? Why did Turner get two
Yeah, well,
cracks
Turner
at
will
it?
tell you the story. I'm sitting next to Turner at dinner at a golf tournament. So one of the things we do is we have some of these new guys that join this peer-to-peer counseling group is basically what it is. We call it Team 43. And we get up to speak. And I said, "Why are you here, Turner?" He looked perfectly normal. And he said, "I can't get out of my mind what I saw in Afghanistan." And it was a pretty horrible tale. He got up and spoke about it, and then writes me this unbelievably profound letter, which was an eye-opener to me. And so the first painting I did of Turner was the guy who couldn't get the tragedy out of his mind because he wouldn't talk about it. And then he gets up at the Bush Center, a big crowd of strangers, and begins to open up about it, and then writes me a letter saying it's the beginning of my recovery, basically, is what he said. And he taught me and everybody else at the Bush Center involved with this Warrior Initiative that it's just as courageous to talk about an invisible wound of war as it is to go to war in the first place. And that unless you're willing to admit you have a problem, you're never going to solve the problem. And so I painted a dark Turner and an optimistic Turner. And he's now gone on to lead troops. And one of the things that he won't tell you, he's too modest, is that he's taken it upon himself to convince these young troops under his command that if you have a problem, talk about it and get it fixed because we need you.
Yeah, well, Chris, we can't thank you enough for being here today. Obviously, thank you for your service. Tell us a little bit from your perspective about your story, about your service, and the journey you've been on
Okay.
as President Bush was describing.
Okay. So my first deployment was when President Bush was still in office, and it was during the surge in Iraq. And I was a young lieutenant going out every day in Baghdad in what I always called the Wild West. And we were in contact with the enemy near daily for 15 months. Came back from that. I didn't really have too many problems that I was willing to talk about, but they continued to bother me a little bit. Fast forward a little bit to Afghanistan, where I'm not out every day. I'm not in contact with the enemy every day. It was a very it wasn't a good job that I was in from a, I'm not John Wayne out there doing anything. I was actually what you would call the FOB mayor. So I was in charge of everything on the base that had to do with living conditions. So one day, believe it or not, I was inventorying generators and air conditioning units, and I'm driving around with 2 soldiers with me, and we stop our vehicle, we get out, and all of a sudden we see an Afghan security guard running towards us, probably 150 meters away. And I had eaten dinner with these guys. I had broke bread with them. They were our friends. They lived on the FOB. They guarded the FOB. But the one thing I knew is they were not supposed to be anywhere unescorted without an American soldier escorting these guys. So my initial instinct was maybe the individual that was in the tower with him had been injured, hurt, killed. He continues to approach us. He's running towards us. I can tell he's acting very erratic. And he gets about, now he's 50 yards from us and he's still running towards us. So I make the decision to tell the guys that I'm with to chamber a round in our pistol. Because when you're on the FOBs over there, you don't walk around with a round in your pistol or your rifle. Now he gets about 20 feet away from me, and I'm trying to motion for him to put his weapon down. And at that second, he raised his AK-47, pointed it right at me, and had a misfire. And that was one of the things that continued to haunt me for the months leading up into that deployment. I was reliving listening to that sound. He immediately got his weapon working again and started shooting at us. I got grazed in the leg. I never felt it. But the firefight went on for quite some time because we had our pistols, and we're in Arkansas. There's a lot of gun folks out there. We had 9mm pistols, and he had an AK-47. He was wearing body armor, and he had a helmet. So contrary to Hollywood, to hit a moving target at 20 feet in the head is pretty darn difficult. So once we realized that our bullets were ineffective, we started shooting him in the legs, and then finally, and I have a picture that I see almost every day because it's hanging on my wall. A Romanian sniper shot and killed him from one of the towers. Otherwise, it would have been a little different ending of that day. Unfortunately, prior to coming over towards us to attack us, he had killed another soldier, shot him in the back while he was working on a vehicle on the base. And the visible wound was easy to heal. That went away. But I probably didn't sleep for a week after that, maybe more than an hour at a time. I was always on guard. I was terrified, not only of something like that happening again, but I had put my trust in these individuals that were living with us and guarding us and had turned on us. I get back from deployment about 6 months later, and I didn't really want to talk about it with anybody. I had some therapists who knew me and knew that it would have happened, and they had approached me to ask if I wanted to talk, and I said, no, I'm good. I'm dealing with it. But I wasn't. I was drinking a lot. Compounding that with the medication they were giving me was it was a very unhealthy way to cope. And my wife could see it as well. A year later, I applied for the Warrior Open. A friend of mine had done some work for the Military Service Initiative and had encouraged me to apply. And I get there, and it's a great event. The camaraderie and the fellowship of the men and women involved in Team 43 is saving lives. I'll tell you that. It is saving lives, not only within Team 43, but beyond, outside the walls of Team 43. But the dinner that President Bush was referring to was interesting, because I had my dad with me, and it's President Bush, Lee Trevino, and a couple other pretty prominent donors. So when he talks about seeing, kind of the dark side I just wasn't really engaged. And if you can sit there and not be engaged with Lee Trevino and President Bush, you can imagine the stories that were going on at that table. He could see. And knowing what I know now, looking back on it, I did miss an opportunity for some good jokes with Lee Trevino. But like you said, I had to stand up and tell my story. And I hadn't told my wife the entire story. I hadn't told my father, and my father was actually with me that week. I hadn't told anybody. And he hands you the microphone, you stand up, and you can't tell a former commander-in-chief no to anything. And I turn around, and there's probably twice as many people that are in this room, and the lights were probably about 5 times brighter. And I told my story. And as soon as I did, he hugged me, he said, "Great job," and I felt 1,000 pounds come off my shoulders. And it took that to realize that it's talking about it, and it's talking about it and coping with it in a healthy manner. And it got me on the right track to healing. It got me off the wrong path towards healing. And like you said, I wrote in that letter, I had to, because I knew that was the moment that changed my life for the better. And now I'm charging myself to reach out to the folks that don't have the ability to be told by a president to tell your story, the ones that are afraid to tell their story, to get them on that correct path towards recovery.
That's great. Yeah.
Good job, buddy.
So, Nick, how about your story? What inspired you? Because you joined before 9/11, just prior to that, and tell us a little bit about your military service and then how you ended up with Team 43.
Okay. It's funny. I grew up in Emerson, Arkansas, just a little south of here. And so the night I graduated high school,
You're not going to call the Hogs, are you?
I'm not going to call the Hogs.
Right.
Now, it's funny.
You'll have some willing participants.
I just taught my 2-year-old to call the Hogs, so it's hilarious. But anyway, so the night I graduated high school, my dad sits me down. He's like, I just don't know the path for you. You can go to school, you can do this, but you can't stay in my house. You have 30 days to get out. No more free sandwiches. It's funny. My pops is right here, by the way. He's gonna punch me when we leave. But so I did. I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was like, it's honorable. Let's join the military. And then September 11th happened, and right away I kind of knew what I was going to be doing, and I accepted that challenge. And in 2003, I did my first tour overseas. I was 20 years old when I first went over. I went back again when I was 22. I was attached to the 3rd Infantry Division. Mm-hmm. And then I went back again in 2005, or in 2008, I'm sorry. And I went in 2005, 2003, and 2008. Yeah. And in 2008 is when I was injured. And we were just out on a routine mission, and these 2 members of the Taliban were watching us drive down this dirt road, and they remotely detonated a 20-pound anti-tank mine. It hit right under the gear shift of the truck I was driving. It crushed every bone in my face, every bone in my right arm, my right hand. Most of my right side was crushed. So what's ironic about that is, we're talking about the importance of being together, having people like Chris and President Bush to, pull this out of you. When I was injured, I fell down in this ditch. I stayed in the truck through the blast, and then I went face first in this culvert, this 9-foot ditch. And I laid there for 10 minutes conscious by myself. My team had to evacuate before they could come back to get me. And that's a long time to be alone. Couldn't move or anything like that. And, they made it back, and, they bandaged me up and made it home. And, it was the support and everything like that. And, this is back a long time ago. This is back in 2008. And then, I started meeting other veterans that really kind of gave me a different perspective on things, because we did lose friends over there and, that weren't going to be able to come home. And so, here I am laid up in this bed, and, I don't have anything to complain about, really. The docs told me I might not ever walk again. And maybe I'm just stubborn, but I didn't like that answer. 2 months later, I walked out of that hospital, out of Walter Reed. So, and I found golf, started using that. Buddy told me about the Warrior Open in 2011, the first year that it happened, and I was fortunate enough to get selected. And, you know, I randomly got this caddy, so I'll share this story real quick. I randomly got this caddy, and awesome guy, did a great job caddying. You know, I don't tell him that, but he did. And it's funny, I stayed in touch with the guy, and I'm visiting with him, and I had moved to Texas during this time, and, you know, and he's like, hey, my daughter, she just graduated college, you guys should hang out and get to know one another. And then we did. And then we started dating, and then he told me I stole the sandwich off his plate. He wasn't happy about that. It's okay now. Married almost 5 years. We have 2 little girls. But the Warrior Open, it wasn't just that, you know, it was the camaraderie of it all. It was this brotherhood, you know, it was beyond a golf tournament than you could ever imagine. You know, guys that don't even play golf anymore that did that first year, I still talk to. Yeah. You know, and not to mention, you know, my spouse, obviously, every day I get to relive it, so bless her heart. So
That's great.
yeah.
So then, how did y'all find out that all of a sudden you're going to be featured as this New York Times best-selling author, former president of the United States, is now going to feature you in his book?
So I got a text from a buddy of mine who followed the Bush Center on Twitter, and he's like, I think this is you. And I'm like, and it was a picture of President Bush in his studio painting. And my first portrait was on its side on the floor, leaning up against the wall. And I was like, no, maybe.
Whoa. Might want to go back to painting dogs. How about you, Nick? How'd you find out?
You know, it's, again, like I say, I stay in touch with a lot of people at the Bush Center down there, and a lot of people on the team, and I'd gotten an email, and they told me that he was going to paint me. And I mean, what do you say to that? You know, your former commander-in-chief is going to paint you. I mean, that's humbling. It's exciting, it's scary at the same time. Like, where did he get that picture? You know what I mean? But it's amazing. I mean, that's something that not only do I get to cherish for the rest of my life, but so does my family, you know, and other veterans alike that I meet down the road. You know, it's such a huge honor. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the original stayed with our foundation, but I made a G-clay for just 1 G-clay per person. And so, in other words, it's a limited edition. It's the most limited edition you can have. And so each guy's got one, which is, I think, pretty cool.
Pretty awesome.
So the other thing that's a great thing about this book is that where the proceeds are going and what this is helping fund. I know when you were leaving office, you knew a big part of your post-presidency was going to be the vets and the support for them. Can you talk about what this is helping fund and what the Institute is up to?
Yeah, so one reason, obviously I've got a kinship with these men because under my orders they went into combat. Secondly, I still remember distinctly how Vietnam veterans were treated in the 70s, despicably, by our country. And I vowed I'd do my best to make sure that didn't happen again. Now, thankfully, it didn't take much effort because the American people are unbelievably supporting of our vets. And thirdly, you know, there's a lot of concern about the future of America. I have less concern than most because I know the vets. These are people who've had an extraordinary leadership experience, when you think about it, personal responsibility, courage, teamwork, sacrifice. Those are the kind of traits that you want for future leaders. And so, in being a strong American, I want to help the future of our country. And the way to do so, one way to do so, is help vets transition. And it's not an easy transition. Well, he hadn't transitioned yet. He's still on active duty. You're the wrong witness. And so the Veterans Program, and one of the key things about the Veterans Program is and this book will kind of explain that to you, is you got to admit you got a problem. That's where Turner comes in. And a good way to do that is to encourage a vet to go to a peer-to-peer counseling network, these groups of vets that serve. Team Rubicon. I mean, there's a lot of them. Some of them really good, some of them not so good. Team 43 is really good, by the way. And that once they get there and realize they have a problem, is to those that need the help, direct them to psychologists that are working. And some of them are very good, and some of them aren't so good. Some VAs are good, some VAs are understaffed. But the purpose is to say, I need help. Help these guys get with people that'll convince them to get help, and then get them help. And so that's what we're doing at the Bush Center. I'm a big believer in the use of American influence to shape the peace. And I'm worried about an America that retreats. 9/11, the lesson was the human condition elsewhere matters to the security of this country. How other people live matters to whether or not our country is secure. And it seems we've forgotten that lesson to a certain extent. And so one of the things we do at the Bush Center is we promote programs that remind people about our nation's great compassion. So, for example, cervical cancer is the leading cause of death on the continent of Africa for women, obviously. And so we've got an effort to rally countries and private sector to deal with cervical cancer. And you got to ask, is that in our national interest? And we at the Bush Center think it is, to show compassion. We can't solve every problem. We can help a lot. And so we got that now. We're big defenders of the free market. Walmart existed because they're smart, capable, and there was a marketplace. And a lot of people have benefited from it. And so we got to defend the market. We've got women's initiatives. And then one of the more interesting ones is that Bubba Clinton and I, now he calls me W, I call him Bubba. And these libraries atrophy with time. You know, like, how many of you want to go to the James K. Polk Library? and so we got to keep them relevant. And one way to do it is have a program that takes mid-career men and women and teach them leadership traits as a result of our presidency. So the Clinton Library, Bush Library 41, Bush Library 43, and LBJ we've set up a leadership program. And it's not a political thing. It's a way to inspire young Americans to serve, which I think is a necessary component. And so that's one of the key programs as well. And
We've had some Walmart associates
yeah, you have.
Really?
A couple of them failed out, but other than that.
Set myself up for that one, didn't I? Yeah.
Yeah. No, they're great. You've had some. And they're from all walks. It's remarkable to see this crowd of people. So there's a lot of polarization in our society. One reason why I think is because we don't take time to listen to the other person. There's no empathy. But this program creates interesting empathy for people who never felt that they could possibly relate to each other, and yet as a result of this program they do, and they continue to infect the communities in which they live, which, anyway, it's a useful program.
Yeah. So, particularly on this issue of invisible wounds, and I'll throw it out to any of you, kind of there's some stigma around that as well. Is there things that we as typical citizens who are interacting with vets, is there any advice for us in interacting with vets, particularly those with who are struggling with these invisible wounds?
So for me, I mean, and this isn't a shameless plug for the book, but read the book in a sense of, not only is it stories of sacrifice, it's stories of triumph and continued service to the nation. So every single one of those stories is unique, and every single one of those stories shows somebody who has faced adversity, defeated it, and is now excelling in life. So I use it as if someone's like, oh, you're painted in that book, right? I was like, yeah, I am. Take a look, but then read every single other story. And then as a community, if we just spread the word that a veteran isn't John Rambo sharpening his knife in the corner, that a veteran is a contributing member of society and brings those unique skills that make them more competitive with their peers, I think that can progress reducing the stigma of those issues.
That's great.
Yeah, one of the things, Walmart's pulling its weight. How many vets you've employed so far?
So the initiative underway, we've had about over 243,000 veterans we've hired in the last 5 years,
Yeah.
and we've now expanded that to military spouses, and we've hired over 12,000 military spouses.
That's awesome. I told Bartlett if they need a greeter, I'm available down in Central Texas.
Well, I was inclined to put your application in, but when you said you can't stand very long, I was like...
Well played.
So what you don't know is there is a civilian-military divide. Start with language. Somebody applies for a job in Walmart. What's your skill, son? Sniper. I don't think we need one this year. But had they understood the language of the private sector, talked about the traits that required to be a sniper, then all of a sudden the employer would have said, wow, I think that's the kind of person we need to hire. On the other hand, the employers need to be thoughtful about the language of the vet and understand there is a natural gap. And that's where Walmart has excelled. They help the vet be able to come up with the language necessary to match skill versus need. And so, and one way to help is you can't help on post-traumatic stress. You just can't, and neither can I. To the extent we can't relate. We think we can relate. Oh, go see your preacher, But it doesn't work, It's a much more complex solution to save. But to say, hey, man, seek help, and I'll admire you more if you do, all of a sudden is a valid contribution to make as somebody not engaged in the military. And
Yeah, that's right. Nick, as you made the transition into civilian life, so you've got 5 more years left? What are some observations or things we should think about on the other side of the ledger as vets are transitioning back into the private sector?
I definitely think language is probably the biggest piece.
Yeah.
It was one of the biggest pieces for me. I didn't know how to articulate that, transition from military to civilian world, especially when you're sitting down to write a resume. What have you been doing for the last 8 years? Well, I can clean M9 in like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's that piece. I think, it just translating those skill sets over. It's attention to detail. That's a different way to put that. I cleaned the M9 in 36 seconds. Yeah. So, I think the language piece is huge. It's a barrier you've got to get over that.
Yeah, we found it ourselves that you're naturally, as a business, you're trying to put people in certain boxes. And what we've learned through the process of the last 4 or 5 years is those intangible skills, not the hard skills, the soft skills you learn in an environment like that, and how we're able to then apply that in our stores and our management teams. And the good thing is that I think well over 50,000 of those vets who we've hired are now going up into management positions within the company and within those stores. So we're learning ourselves about how to take advantage and tap into those unique skill sets you have. So it's fantastic. So as we wrap up here, there's got to be, did you have any do-overs on these paintings or anybody in this
Unlike
project?
the presidency, you got do-overs.
That's true.
So the great thing about painting an oil paint is you can scrape it off. Don't try watercoloring, though. It doesn't scrape. Here's the problem. A painting never ends. And so I'd go upstairs, 98 warriors, surrounded by 98 warriors in my studio. And I'd get up there and, oh man, I better touch this person up. But the problem is you put a touch up and then all of a sudden you have to repaint the whole face. And so there's a lot of do-overs. And the real challenge is to stop. And people say, how long does it take to paint Turner's portrait? And and the answer is really, until it's finished, which seems never ending until you actually say, get Turner out of my house.
And you recognized yourself, you said.
What's that?
You recognized it, right, when you saw it for the first time?
I did. I did.
So you kind of made a quip about...
If he didn't, he wouldn't have said it, though,
Yeah, exactly. So I got to ask, because you made the quip, the sidebar about Putin.
Putin,
Did he ever give you any feedback, or any of those other world leaders weigh in on...
No, not really. I showed it
going spending vacations together these days. No.
I showed it to Dalai Lama. But he's such a sweet guy, I mean, he's a genuinely sweet, sweet-souled man. That he kind of had that little high-pitched giggle, which I took as a sign of affirmation. And I didn't show it to Putin, no. Which reminds me of my favorite Putin story. Shall I tell it? Okay, yeah. So, I don't know if you remember Barney. Barney was a Scottish Terrier. So, when I was president, he kind of ruled the roost. People like Bartlett didn't really like Barney, but it didn't matter because I did. And
It was like the son you never had. I mean,
yeah,
it was. Like,
it was.
And he knew it. I mean,
Yeah, he did know it. Exactly. The son I didn't have. Our daughters used to get a little furious about me saying that. And and so I introduced Putin to Barney. Now Putin has changed because the price of oil goes up. When we first met him, he was a supplicant. He was broke. Then the price of oil goes up, and the real Putin starts to emerge. And Barney at Camp David kind of waddles out like a Scottish Terrier does, and he dissed him. He didn't say anything, but his body language clearly said, "You call that thing a dog?" And it kind of hurt my feelings, but I wasn't representing Barney. I was representing you. Anyway, so I kept it in. I didn't say anything. A year later, Laura and I go visit Putin and Ludmilla. Now, that was his wife at the time. Subsequent to that, he has decided he'd rather hang out with a water ballerina, 25 years his younger. Anyway, we're walking across his
a little TMI, a little too much.
yeah. We're walking across his birch-lined yard and his dacha outside of Moscow, and he said, "Would you like to meet my dog, Coney?" Now, I'd forgotten about the Barney disc, because when you're president, you got a lot on your mind. And outbounds this huge Russian hound. And Putin says, "Bigger, stronger, and faster than Barney." So here's a lesson in today's life. You know, if you're on the internet, then you fire back, "Yeah, but he's smarter, he's stronger, he's tougher." You know, it's kind of three-word quips back and forth. I didn't say anything because it was one of the most insightful comments that I had gotten from a world leader. I mean, you got to ask the question, does this guy have that big a chip on his shoulder? And the answer is yes, and then you got to ask why. Why does he have a chip on his shoulder? And the answer is because the demise of the Soviet, in his mind, was bad for the world. And what you're watching is Putin trying to reinstate Soviet hegemony with a weak hand. Unless, of course, the United States decides it's none of our business to support our allies, in which case his hand gets stronger. And so the lesson of that story is, I think, kind of a funny Putin story. But in life, you got to listen to what the other person says because it's unbelievably instructive. And one of the real challenges we have in this country is to convince a younger generation of Americans that the best communication is face-to-face. And it's important to listen to why the other person feels the way they feel in order to have a kind of a kinder country.
Thank you so much for your time, for being here today. What a great treat this has been. I am going to ask that the President and First Lady can get out here to stay in your seats until they're able to leave here. But I really want to thank Nick and Chris and obviously President Bush.
Thank you all for having us.
Thanks, brother.